Welcome to this lecture series on Environment and Ecology presented by Mentors for IS in association with Bangalore IS Academy and Namak APSC. So in this video, we'll be completing our discussion about ecological succession. This is the third important function of an ecosystem. So we are going one by one and we are covering each and every function of an ecosystem. So this is the third important function of an ecosystem, that is ecological succession. Okay, so this particular term, that is ecological succession, refers to the process by which the structure of a biological community evolves over time. So, for example, take a forest, the tropical wet evergreen forests that you have along the Western Ghats. Do you think the forests have been there always, or did it evolve over a period of time from a barren piece of land? Of course, it took hundreds of years for the forest to develop from a barren piece of land. So this process of an entire forest developing and evolving over a barren piece of land is known as succession. That is the steady and gradual change in a species of a given area with time and changing environment. So here what we will be doing is that we will be distinguishing ecological succession into two types, that is primary succession and secondary succession. Now primary succession occurs essentially in lifeless areas, and secondary succession, that is the second type of classification, secondary succession occurs in areas where a community previously existed but now has been removed. So you'll understand more when we discuss about each of these successions, that is primary succession and secondary succession. So first we'll take up primary succession. Now primary succession begins in barren areas. For example, you could consider say you have an underwater volcanic eruption, and due to this underwater volcanic eruption a new island has been formed. Or you could take a bare rock which has been exposed by retreating glacier. So as of now you don't have an ecosystem itself, a very diverse ecosystem on that piece of barren land, because it has to be worked upon. So this is where primary succession comes into picture. So what I'm trying to say is that when you have a new island formed due to an underwater volcanic eruption, or you have a bare rock which has just been exposed due to retreating glacier, now there is a new habitat which is waiting to be colonized for the first time. So what will happen is that first, weathering and natural forces will start to break down the substrate rock enough for the establishment of a few plants and lichens which demand very little soil requirements. So these are actually known as the pioneer species, the first to occupy a new piece of land. So what I'm trying to say is that once a new piece of land has been exposed or has been formed, and now there is a possibility of a new habitat colonizing in that particular piece of land for the first time, after weathering, when soil just begins to form, few plants will get established over there. So the first species to get established on that piece of land, they are known as the pioneer species, because they are pioneering there for the first time. Now what will happen is, over hundreds of years, the pioneer species will further break down the rock and also add organic matter, providing for the formation of soil. So this process will repeat multiple times during succession, where at each stage new species will move into the area due to the favorable changes made to the environment by the preceding species, and may also be successful in replacing their predecessors. So at some point the community may reach a relatively stable state and stop changing in composition. This is when the biotic interactions become so intricate that no new species can be admitted, and this final stage is known as the climax community, which is a very stable stage and can endure for hundreds of years. For example, a fully developed rainforest. So I want you to understand this very clear. Just take it with respect to this particular diagram. So the first plan to colonize an area is called the pioneer community or the pioneer species. You already know that. The final stage of succession is called the climax community, which is very stable and can endure for a sufficiently longer period of time until and unless it is disturbed by any external force or any external agent. The stage leading to the climax community are called the successional stages or the intermediate species, and sometimes in some sources it might also be referred to as the seral community. So I hope this is clear. It will start with the pioneer species and it will end with the climax community, whereas the transition is by the intermediate species, also known as the seral community. Okay, so next we move on to the secondary succession. Now, the secondary succession follows a major disturbance such as a fire or a flood or even human intervention such as deforestation, which will destroy a mature stable community, and therefore the area is now available for recolonization, meaning primary succession had already happened, but due to some reason this climax community is destroyed, and hence this particular region is once again available to be recolonized, where this entire process of pioneer species, intermediate species and climax community will take on. This entire range of succession will be carried out all over again. Then it is known as secondary succession. So the stages of secondary succession are similar to those of primary succession, but the only difference is that this is recolonization and not colonization for the first time. However, unlike primary succession, which always begins on a barren surface, secondary succession begins in environments that already possess soil. Therefore, secondary succession is relatively faster when compared to primary succession. Please remember, secondary succession is relatively faster than primary succession, meaning if primary succession is going to take 1,000 years, I'm just giving an example. If primary succession takes 1,000 years, secondary succession may only take about 200 years. Okay, so I hope this difference between primary succession and secondary succession is clear. Unlike primary succession, secondary succession always starts with well-developed soil formed at that site, and also secondary succession is much faster, relatively faster when compared to primary succession. Okay, so there are certain characteristics of succession, that is, whenever you have succession taking place, please remember, you can just make a note of this, you'll have increased productivity, you'll have increased biodiversity, the food webs become more and more complex, there is a shift of nutrients from reservoirs, there is increase in niche development. Also, succession would occur faster in areas existing in the middle of large continents, because the seeds of plants belonging to different several communities would reach there much faster and help in the establishment of a climax community. Okay, so next, apart from primary succession and secondary succession, we have something known as autogenic succession and allogenic succession. Now, if you've already understood primary and secondary succession, we'll move on ahead with autogenic and allogenic succession. Very simple. When succession is brought about by vegetation and organisms in the community itself, it is known as autogenic succession. For example, when larger species like trees mature, they produce shade onto the developing forest floor that tends to exclude light requiring species. Therefore, Shade requiring species will invade and replace light requiring species. So this succession, this replacement is induced by vegetation and organisms in the community itself, and therefore it is known as autogenic succession. The other type is allogenic succession. Unlike autogenic succession, allogenic succession is caused by external environmental influences like soil erosion, leaching, waterlogging, etc., which will induce and establish certain unfavorable conditions, because of which the existing communities may perish or it might not be suitable for them, and hence some other species will invade and it will replace. Also, sometimes animals like pollinators and herbivores may also play a role. Okay. Next we have autotrophic and heterotrophic succession. Very simple. As the name suggests, you have autotrophic or heterotrophic succession. This is depending on who is causing the succession. So succession in which initially green plants are much greater in quantity is known as autotrophic succession, and the ones in which heterotrophs are greater in quantity is known as heterotrophic succession. Very simple. If autotrophs are larger in number, it is autotrophic succession. If the succession is caused by animals which are larger in number, heterotrophs which are larger in number, then it is known as heterotrophic succession. Okay. Then we have seasonal and cyclic succession. So unlike secondary succession, these types of vegetation changes are not dependent on disturbance but are periodic changes arising from fluctuating species interaction or recurring events. It is therefore a change in the ecosystem on a cyclical basis. For example, you may have some plants which remain dormant for a long period of time and emerge all at once, which may replace some other species. This is known as seasonal and cyclic succession. Okay, so with this we complete our discussion about ecologic succession. It is actually a very simple topic but an important function of the ecosystem. So there is still one more function of the ecosystem yet to be completed. So we will be discussing the last function of the ecosystem in the next video. So thank you for watching. If you do have any doubts, please do write in the comment section.